In his book, Dr. Archibald Hart discusses the topic of anhedonia. The term anhedonia specifically means inability to experience pleasure. The book, Thrilled to Death, the title gives it away in many ways, in that this idea of overstimulation, so online technologies, gaming, gambling, this idea of an overstimulated culture and a culture that's oversaturated with technology has a propensity to lose the capacity to experience pleasure in the little things, the holding of a hand, the enjoyment of a sunset. We hear about these things written in songs or longing for a simpler day, longing for an easier day. On a neurological level, there's something to be said for a life that's unplugged, a life that's not so saturated in stimulation and technology, a life that's not bombarded with the constant escalation neurologically that leads to the inability to actually experience and enjoy pleasure in things that are typically pleasurable. Now, part of this cultural phenomenon, if we want to call it a cultural phenomenon, relates back to the idea of lots of high-risk behaviors, spending money that folks don't have in the context of perhaps gambling, seeking risky sexual behaviors like online pornography. So certainly there's cultural influence on this idea of our inability to experience pleasure. Much of this starts in childhood. Again, we don't talk about childhood as problematic. We talk about children as kind of being ruled by their impulses and can't hold them responsible for things. In many ways, the family unit lays the foundation for high-risk, high-stimulation activities in these children as they age across the lifespan. Specifically, engaging in things like X Games, motocross, high-risk activities that involve going fast, using motorized vehicles to engage in athletic sports, high competition activities. This idea of stress and pressure on a neurological level have been shown to increase one's internal level of stress and expectation, significantly decreasing one's ability to experience pleasure. The idea of a threshold, and perhaps movies is the best example that we can go to make sense of this idea of threshold. Not too far long ago, the idea of a PG-rated movie, a PG-13 rated movie, an R-rated movie, we were able to predict or have some semblance of what to expect content-wise in those unique ratings. Well, what we've seen is an escalation in gore, an escalation in nudity, an escalation in violent content. So an R-rated movie now has more graphic content in it than an R-rated movie, say 12 to 15 years ago. A PG-13 rated movie now would have merited an R rating in that same time span. So what we see is this desensitization process. We're desensitized to the nudity. We're desensitized to the gore. We're desensitized to this process of escalation of adrenaline and dopamine. An example, there's a movie that came out recently within the last couple of years where the opening scene involves a young lady running around completely in the nude, being chased by a pickaxe murderer. That scene that lasts about 5 minutes culminates in a very graphic and very violent death at the hands of the primary antagonist in the film. Movies are now starting out with this huge escalation, priming neurologically chemicals that they know are dependent. Our experience of pleasure is dependent on the escalation of this neurological process, the dopamine, the adrenaline, that kind of simultaneously create this cocktail of pleasurable experience. We're very excited by adrenaline. We experience a lot of pleasure through dopamine, and this combination effect is something that we really have little control over. So the introduction of a stimulus like nudity, paired with the anticipation and the fear associated with somebody being chased and potentially murdered, culturally we gravitate towards that in record numbers. This process over time, with our children being exposed much younger to that same content, is culminating with their inability to experience pleasure from the simple things in life. Gaming is another great example of this idea of high stimulation, high threshold. Television shows, cartoons. Children specifically are targeted by these industries because they know if we can set a threshold young enough, we know that we can control the stimulation later on, and we can control the types of stimuli that are going to draw children, teenagers, young adults into our content. In many ways, it's kind of like a hook. if they can get that hook in young enough, if we can set that threshold high enough at a young enough age, in many ways I can predict and control the type of content, the type of experiences, the type of stimuli that you're going to seek out much later on. So violent video games, overstimulation of video games in general, early exposure to pornography, all these things that are significantly impacting not just the development of children, but across the lifespan. They're desensitizing us to what is healthy, what is typical, what is normal. A recent study that came out from Britain specifically examines young girls from the ages of 16 to 18 years old are requesting chaperones on the dates that they engage in with young men because of the sexual expectation that's been placed upon them. A rampant pornographic generation, much like what we see here statistically in America. There's this expectation by these young men that they're going to live out and play out at 15 and 16 years old these same things that they've seen in deviant pornographic productions. Cultural trend that's taking place, like I said, is all of a sudden women, young girls, 15, 16, 17 years old, are so afraid of engaging romantically for fear of being sexually preyed upon, either through expectation or through being taken advantage of sexually. Desensitization, very serious issue. How we can control that in our lives, in the lives of children, and in our lives as individuals, is by being very mindful about the content that we allow into our homes, by really being mindful and screening the content that we allow into our own lives in an effort to keep a low threshold of stimulation. Because as that threshold for stimulation increases, so too increases our need for more and more stimulation and more deviant stimulation to have the same excitatory experience that we would have otherwise. In spite of our best efforts to screen content out of our lives, invariably something will manifest itself. It'll be a pop-up on the computer, it'll be a movie that inadvertently shows nudity on the screen, it'll be an email that's sent that includes some sort of graphic content. There's no perfect way to keep out, to screen out, to block really high stimulation content, really graphic content from our lives. The most effective way for maintaining a lower level of stimulation in one's life, a low threshold, if you will, for that stimulation, is by engaging in relationship, by staying in connection, by maintaining healthy relationship, enjoying the pleasure of simple connection, of relationship, of time shared together. A product like Saavi is geared towards helping maintain openness in relationship so that that healthy connection can always take place.